Hello class, this is our second lesson on context for catching dreams. This is the Western expansion. So reviewing from yesterday the Native American lifestyle, they were on the Great Plains, they were nomadic, they were hunter-gatherers, they had a tribal organization, and the tribes assimilated the customs of each other as they were grouped on reservations, and also prior to reservations as they were just pushed west by the settlers and the colonials. And over here on the right, you see a ledger drawing by a Native American done during this time period. Ledger drawings were where they would acquire notebooks and whatever that were left behind at various places and use them to kind of record things that were happening. And one of the interesting things you see here is, if you look at this fellow with the shield and that stick with the bend on it, that's a coup stick. And when they fought, a lot of times, unless there was something serious going on, instead of killing their enemy, they would count coup, which is you would take this stick and basically knock him really good with it, and it would dishonor him, and you would be taking their honor. Of course, if you look up, you see a slightly different story. You see some people here with guns and powder horns, muskets that are shooting at Native Americans during probably Indian Wars, things of that nature. Part of one of the early issues, even though they caught on very quickly, is that if you count coup against somebody with a gun, it doesn't matter. They're still going to shoot you. Okay, so what Western expansion was, it was a time period when the Anglo-American settlers pushed west. Anglo-Americans are white people, referring to them as Anglo-Americans from this time period because a lot of the people involved were recent immigrants from Europe, and the United States didn't exist the way it was, the way it is right now. Not everything was a state yet. So as these people pushed west, it resulted in conflict with Native Americans and lasting changes to their culture and lifestyle. So you can see some of the key areas. There is the Lewis and Clark Trail that went up through here, the Santa Fe Trail, which went down to New Mexico, the Oregon Trail, I bet you've played that video game, the good old Pony Express, and the Transcontinental Railroad. Some of the causes of Western expansion, there were a lot of them. It's a lot more complicated than I'm talking about. But, okay. Again, some of the causes of Western expansion. European immigration, there was a lot happening in Europe right then, including famines, and also countries just wanting to get rid of people they viewed as being undesirable, whether the people were criminals or whether they owned something that the country wanted. And a lot of them were entering into the East. The cities became overpopulated fairly quickly, and with the rumors of land in the West, people very eagerly left in order to start a new life. Coming from the South, there was a displacement after the Civil War. When the Civil War ended and there was the emancipation, there was land given to people, and also people just wanted to change the area that they lived in. And again, free land in the West. The gold rush, everybody knows about the gold rush in San Francisco, but there was also silver and copper rushers. Silver in Nevada was definitely one of the big ones. The railroads made transportation easier. The Homestead Act, where you would be given land for free if you agreed to live on it and farm it, or, have herds on it for a set amount of time. And then there were the territorial claims, because other countries were still fighting over chunks of what became the United States. It was kind of a pressure to get as many people there as possible so that we could say, hey, all our people are here, it belongs to us. But there were people there already, but that didn't matter. And over here you see something called a coffin ship, which is what these ships were known as in Ireland, that would bring the very poor immigrants over, and they would be packed solid, and there was often not enough food and water and air, and people would get sick and die very rapidly. Okay, now we're going to talk about some of the gender roles of people in the West, because it is interesting. It was a different kind of lifestyle. Women in the West. All right. And I'm going to skip around. It's not going to go in the order on the left. You had your settlers. They are the people, think Oregon Trail. We're packing up our stuff in our covered wagon, and we're heading west to get a homestead, and we're going to live on there and grow whatever it is we grow. Okay, that's great. Because you had these families going into the West, you had children and you needed teachers. Some teachers came from the eastern parts, and some came from the families that moved west. Teachers were mostly young, unmarried women, and by young, I mean most of you would be the same age as your teachers then. We're talking, if you made it to high school, you were qualified to teach. You could teach until you got married, and then you had to quit. And then sometimes older ladies who were widowed and did not have children also could become teachers. But that was actually fairly rare. Missionaries came west with the churches in order to convert people and to establish churches in the settlements. Prostitutes happened, and some went out there with the intention of being prostitutes and making money. However, there was also issues of, if you were a settler and your husband died and nobody else married you, and you didn't have another way to support yourself, that was often your only choice. If you were a teacher and say you had a relationship and became pregnant or something and they wouldn't marry you, that was your only choice. Sometimes the prostitutes came from mail order brides. And what a mail order bride is, it's exactly what it sounds. There was a catalog, and women would be listed by a description, and not necessarily a physical description, more like good cook, strong, healthy, that kind of a description. And they would literally be ordered out of these catalogs, and the men would pay for their ticket out west and agree to marry them when they got there. A lot of the mail order brides were from Europe and did not speak English. Think, Eastern Europe, Slovakia, Nordic Europe, Finland, Sweden, Russia, those kind of areas. But there were English and Irish and American mail order brides as well. So the mail order bride gets on a train and goes out west, and her husband is there waiting for her. Sometimes husband didn't make it. They got killed before she got there, and then she was stuck, and if nobody else married her, she didn't have the money to go back, so prostitute. Sometimes they would get there, and the man would look at them and be like, oh no, nope, and same thing. And then sometimes they would get married, more often than not, because women in the West were rare, and they would continue on to have a family. And then you had a few non-traditional women that were the cowgirls, the gunfighters, people like in the picture, that's Annie Oakley. She was and still is considered one of the best shots ever. She toured with the Buffalo Bill Wild West show. There were the Men in the West. You had the ones that you think about all the time. There's the settlers in their covered wagons. There's the prospectors who went out to pan for gold. You have the soldiers, the cavalry officers in particular, with the horses. That was the main type of regiment in the West. Cowboys that herd the cattle from where they're grazed all the way up to the big stock markets in Kansas. Railroad workers that built the railroad across. A lot of times these were immigrants from other countries or freed slaves that worked on the railroads. And you had mountain men who would live a more solitary life, and a lot of times they would make their income by trapping animals for their fur. Outlaws, the bad guys that like to rob the trains and the banks and do all sorts of things. And then you had some limited people like missionaries. Doctors were very rare, and the doctor usually did other things as well. You had salesmen that would travel from place to place. You had reporters that would travel. And then, of course, you had some businessmen that would establish businesses like saloons, which are bars, or general stores, hotels, things of that nature. The person you're looking at is Buffalo Bill Cody, who is one of the most entertaining figures in the West. He was a gunfighter, which is somebody who, in his case, made his living from gambling and then being a good shot and, being able to prove it. Now, all these people in the West ran into the people that were already there, and that caused the Native American conflicts. The primary motivation is land and that idea of land ownership, which is an Anglo idea. Remember, Native Americans are nomadic, and they didn't have the same concept of owning land. And the two key conflicts that we're going to look at are Little Bighorn and Wounded Knee. So, overall, we have to talk about genocide. Genocide, as you should know from history class, is the systematic extermination of a race and culture. So it goes beyond just killing the people. With Native Americans, there was disease that was brought about intentionally. There was war. And then there was the destruction of their lifestyle. Their nomadic lifestyle depended upon the environment. The buffalo was exterminated and almost to extinction, and that was their primary animal. Their languages were outlawed. They were not permitted to speak their language. They were relocated to reservations. The reservations that they were pushed to were often in a very entirely different environment than where they normally lived. So they didn't know how to survive in that environment. It's, for example, we're here in the hot, humid, it's not hot right now, but it's not snowing, south, and if I were to take you and plop you down in Chicago right now, where it has the wind chill of -20 and snow up to your ears, you probably would be an unhappy camper, especially if you didn't have a place to stay and you had to figure it out. They also killed the population base, women and children. In a lot of wars, they officially were told not to kill them, but they did because that is the population that would increase. They outlawed cultural practices like the Dreamcatcher and the ghost dance and a lot of the other rituals, and that stayed outlawed for a very long time. They removed the leaders if they did not arrest them and execute them. leaders that escaped had to go into exile. That's where Buffalo Bill and his Wild West show came in, because he took several of the very important leaders like Sitting Bull and took them to Europe so that they would be safe. And there was also the issue of addiction. There are genetics in people that can cause you to become more prone to be sensitive to different substances. And unfortunately, a lot of Native Americans have the one that is addiction to alcohol is very rapidly occurs. And it's a genetic thing. They did not produce alcohol as it was produced in the West. And over here you see the aftermath of one of the battles where the dead Native Americans would be just pushed into the pit and buried. And if you look closely, there are children and women and old people and everybody else there. And they took pictures like this and used them as postcards. So the buffalo, the American bison, is a keystone species. They are extremely large animals. And before 1800, they were the most numerous large herd animal in the world. There were more buffalo than any other animal that was a big animal. By the time of 1900, they were hunted down to below 1,000 animals. So they were almost hunted to extinction. Today, and we are talking, 120 years later, there's approximately 15,000 wild buffalo. Most of the buffalo that we have are managed buffalo, which means they are bred on farms. Some of them are used for meat and those things, or hunting. And then some of them are released into the wild, but with a controlled breeding, so there's enough genetic differences. On the left, those mounds are buffalo skins. Buffalo hunting, when the natives hunted the buffalo, they used all of it. The meat was used to eat, of course, or preserve. And then the hide was used, the fur was used for warmth, for clothing. The hide was tanned and made into leather. The bones and horns were carved and fashioned into tools. Very little was wasted. However, during this time, a couple things happened. People discovered there was some money to be made with buffalo hide. And so instead of hunting the buffalo one by one, they would run them over cliffs, and then the ones that were dead at the bottom, they would skin them and take their hide. There was also the game on the railroad, because, a long train ride over very flat land is pretty boring. So the sport was to take your gun and shoot out the window and see how many buffaloes you could get. And nobody would do anything with the buffaloes because the train would keep going, and it was just leaving this trail of dead buffaloes behind. And you'll learn more about the buffalo in your assignment. So 2 battles that we're going to talk about briefly. Little Bighorn. This was the decisive Native American victory. General Custer was leading the army, the cavalry in, and he had been responsible for several smaller massacres, and they tricked him. Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull were the 2 generals. They trapped the cavalry in the grassy gulch, which is Little Bighorn, and everybody died. Nobody was left on the U.S. cavalry at all at the end of it, except for, and here is a picture of Crazy Horse, who was in his late teens during the time, and General Custer. General Custer had developed some issues because he has had alcoholism, and he also had syphilis, which is a sexually transmitted disease which affects your brain. And he was a little psychotic at this time and not thinking straight. And this is the only member of the U.S. Cavalry that survived. This is Comanche. And he was already an old horse. He was 21 during the Battle of Little Bighorn, which isn't super old for a horse, but it's getting there. During the battle, he was shot 7 times, and he had gone off to die, as horses do. But they found him 2 days later and saved him, took him back east, retired him, and he lived to be 29, where he died peacefully, and then they had him stuffed. He's one of the few famous stuffed horses in the world, and it looks like he's smiling. He's a good boy. Okay, Wounded Knee. Remember we talked about the ghost dance. The ghost dance, again, was taking place on reservations by unarmed Native Americans in order to call on their ancestors to help them. And what happened was a massive massacre. Again, it's the people were surrounded, unarmed, and they were all killed. What all this kind of resulted in was the forced relocation of Native Americans to reservations, which were managed lands. And later on, you will learn about the rights and what happened on the reservations. Over here, in this map, you can see where the large reservations are. This is the Four Corners area, where the large Dene Navajo reservation is. This is the area that we've been talking about, and you will, yesterday when you were looking at Google Maps, Pine Ridge, Rosebud, those areas are over here. And then if you look over here in North Carolina, we have the Cherokee Reservation, which is our only reservation, but there is a large amount of Native Americans down here close to us. See, that's Pender County right there. And these are the Lumbee tribe. Lumberton is not named for trees and lumber. Lumberton is named after Lumbee Indians. That's why the mascot of Pembroke University is a Native American. And that's where they are. So how life changed on the reservation. The children were taken away from families and relocated to Indian schools. They were given new names. Their languages were outlawed. Their cultural symbols were outlawed. Their religion was outlawed. When they were off the reservation, they had very limited rights. And on the reservations, they had a very low quality of life. Reservations were not prime land. It was usually some sort of land that was wasteland that they was given. And in the Indian schools, it was a lot of them, like this one, the Carlisle Industrial School, they were work schools. It's not like sit down and learn things school. It was like sit down and do this work for me and I'm not going to pay you school. Okay, your assignment today is to investigate buffalo. You can use your Chromebook, traditional or digital drawing materials. There is a linked video about buffalo. It's short, it's about 6 minutes long, and it's a Native American steward of a herd speaking about the buffalo, and he speaks about buffalo as a keystone species. And then you need to listen and draw a diagram of how the buffalo was a keystone species. So think about what was in the video. Remember what I just talked about, how the Native Americans relied on the buffalo for everything. Think about the role of other major predators, smaller animals, and plants. For example, that time and place with the big herd of buffaloes, one of their major predators were packs of wolves. If you kill all the buffaloes and you're a settler with cows, the wolves are going to go for the cows. So then you kill all the wolves. And that's kind of what happened, and that's why the wolves are so endangered and they're working so hard to repopulate them. But that's bonus. Anyway, watch the video, tell me about some buffalo. They're cool critters. And they're kind of tasty.